At its height, Eastern Airlines employed 40,000 people, operated a fleet of more than 250 aircraft, and carried passengers to 26 countries across 3 continents. Its maintenance base at Miami International Airport, anchored around Building 16 in the northeast corner of the field, was, alongside Pan American's adjacent facility, one of the engineering wonders of American commercial aviation, making Miami the largest commercial aircraft maintenance and overhaul complex on Earth. The machinists, avionics technicians, and sheet metal workers who kept Eastern's jets in the air represented, in aggregate, hundreds of thousands of years of accumulated expertise. There were families in Dade County where 3 generations had worn the Eastern uniform. Entire neighborhoods were built on the wages those workers carried home. Then the decisions began. In 1986, Eastern was sold to Texas Air Corporation, a company owned by Frank Lorenzo, a man whose previous airline had been deliberately driven into bankruptcy to break its unions. Within months, Eastern's most profitable assets were being transferred to Lorenzo's other companies at prices a bankruptcy court examiner would later conclude were well below market value. The System 1 computer reservation system, the digital architecture connecting 5,000 travel agents to Eastern's network, was sold to Texas Air at a fraction of its worth. Airbus A300 wide-body jets were moved to Continental Airlines. The lucrative Northeast Shuttle, New York, Washington, Boston, hourly, no reservations, the most valuable short-haul franchise in American aviation, was sold to Donald Trump for $365 million, with Eastern's creditors receiving almost nothing from the deal. In February 1987, the FAA levied a $9.5 million fine against Eastern for safety violations, the largest ever assessed against an airline at that point in history. On March 4, 1989, 8,500 mechanics and ramp workers walked off the job. Within hours, the pilots and flight attendants joined them. By midnight on January 18, 1991, Eastern Airlines stopped flying. Building 16, the ivory tower that Rickenbacker's successors had used as a headquarters, was demolished in the early 2000s. Where the hangars stood, where the engine test cells ran their eardrum-splitting cycles, where mechanics worked through Florida nights keeping 250 aircraft airworthy, a highway ramp now runs close to where the north face of the building once stood. If this kind of story matters to you, if you think the people who actually built things deserve to be remembered, subscribe. We tell one of these every week. This is the story of Eddie Rickenbacker, who built one of the greatest airlines in American history from a $3.5 million handshake with General Motors, and of Frank Lorenzo, the man who took it apart, decision by decision, asset by asset, until all that remained was concrete and silence. Edward Vernon Rickenbacker was born on October 8, 1890, at 1334 East Livingston Avenue, Columbus, Ohio, a small house built with a loan from his mother's parents, 2 miles southeast of downtown. His father, Wilhelm, was a German-speaking Swiss immigrant who worked brewery crews and street paving gangs. His mother, Lizzie, took in laundry to supplement the household income. He was the third of 8 children. When Wilhelm Rickenbacker died in a construction accident in 1904, Eddie was 12 years old. He left school the next day to find work. He lied about his age to get around child labor laws. He worked in a glass factory. He poured steel. He drove a beer delivery wagon. He apprenticed at a cemetery monument yard. What pulled him through each job was engines. The internal combustion engine, arriving into American life exactly as Rickenbacker was, and speaking a language he understood instinctively. By the early 1910s, he was one of the 3 fastest racing drivers in the United States. He ran the Indy 500. He set a land speed record at Daytona in 1914. When America entered World War I, he went to France as a staff driver for General Pershing, but he wanted to fly. He taught himself everything he could. With the help of Colonel Billy Mitchell, he transferred to the 94th Aero Pursuit Squadron, the first American unit to see aerial combat. In 2 months of fighting, just 2 months, he shot down 26 German aircraft. He was awarded the Medal of Honor. He returned home in 1919 as the American ace of aces. What he did next tells you exactly who he was. He turned down a $100,000 offer to appear in Hollywood films. He didn't want fame. He started a car company. It went bankrupt. He bought the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. He lost money on it. He tried to start an airline in Florida. It failed in less than a year. By 1933, having accumulated and shed more ventures than most men attempt in a lifetime, he found himself back inside General Motors' Aviation division, which happened to own a struggling airline called Eastern Air Transport. In 1938, he raised $3.5 million in a single certified check, presented personally to Alfred P. Sloan of General Motors, and bought it outright. He was 48 years old, had failed at more businesses than he had succeeded at, and had just bet everything on commercial air travel at a time when most Americans had never been near a plane. He had found his thing at last. The key to understanding what Eastern became is understanding what it was not supposed to be. When Rickenbacker took control in 1938, Eastern was a marginal carrier. Government mail subsidies propping up a modest passenger operation running up and down the eastern seaboard. Rickenbacker had one guiding conviction. Eastern would run without government subsidy, or it would not run at all. No other airline in America held to that principle. Most of the industry depended on mail contracts to stay viable. The route that proved it possible, the route that defined Eastern for decades, was New York to Florida. In the 1930s and 1940s, this was not obvious money. Florida was not yet the retirement and tourism destination it would become. What Rickenbacker saw, before others, was that the distance was exactly right for commercial aviation. Too long to drive comfortably, too short to require an overnight journey by air. He attacked it with frequency and price. By 1937, Eastern was running 20 daily return flights between New York and Washington alone, every hour on the hour, with a flight time of 1 hour and 20 minutes. The New York to Miami run he developed into the spine of his business. The constraint that sharpened Eastern's model was the mandate never to lose money on government subsidy. Every route had to carry itself. This forced Rickenbacker to think about passenger experience in ways competitors did not. Cheaper fares brought more passengers filled more flights built schedule frequency built loyalty. When he introduced the first reduction in fares, passenger numbers climbed immediately. Then the proof arrived in a single number. In 1935, Eastern posted a modest profit of $38,000. For context, the airline had been losing money for years. That profit, $38,000, enough to pay perhaps a dozen salaries, was produced entirely by commercial revenue. No subsidy, no mail contract lifeline. Eastern was the first airline in the world to operate as, in Rickenbacker's own words, a free enterprise company. Every other American carrier was still feeding from the federal trough. The Great Silver Fleet, the DC-2s and later the Constellations and DC-7s, grew out of that founding discipline. A business built on the conviction that it had to earn every passenger it carried. The conviction held for 20 years. Then the jet age arrived, and the man who had built the whole thing from nothing refused to buy jets. The smell hits you before anything else. Aviation fuel and hydraulic fluid, and something sharper underneath. The bite of metal being worked, of composite panels being stressed and released in engine test cycles that could be heard from a mile away on a still Miami night. The Eastern maintenance base at Miami International was not a single hangar, it was a campus. Building 16, the executive headquarters, known inside the company as the Ivory Tower, sat at the northeast corner of the airfield. Around it spread the overhaul facilities, the engine shops, the avionics bays, the sheet metal sections where damaged panels were cut back and rebuilt by hand. Pan American had built a comparable complex next door in the late 1940s, and together they made Miami International the largest commercial aircraft maintenance and overhaul facility on Earth. Mechanics and their families knew exactly what that meant for the neighborhood. Eastern was the big airline in Miami, one former employee wrote years later. When I was a kid, it seemed like every block had an Eastern family on it, and often 2 or 3. In the engine test cells, the noise was physical. A Pratt & Whitney turbofan running at full power test cycle shook the air itself. Mechanics working the cells communicated by hand signal and the shorthand of long familiarity. The machinery they worked with had names. The Lockheed L-1011 TriStar's Rolls-Royce RB211, notoriously temperamental, which had nearly bankrupted Rolls-Royce itself during development. The Airbus A300's General Electric CF6 series, the Boeing 727's Pratt & Whitney JT8D, 3 of them stacked in the aft fuselage, which Eastern's mechanics came to know with the intimacy of surgeons. George H. Brown served as president of IAM District Lodge 100, the machinists' organization covering Eastern's Miami base, through the critical years of the 1960s. T. Shields served as president of Local Lodge 702, the unit whose members were the hands that held the torque wrenches and ran the bore scopes and signed off the logbooks. Don Repo was a flight engineer and maintenance specialist with 25 years of service, a Massachusetts man who had made his home in Miami and come to know Eastern's aircraft the way a craftsman knows his tools. Eastern employed thousands of Dade County residents, above average wages, excellent benefits. Suppliers across the county survived on Eastern's work. The torque wrench clicks. The panel is closed. The logbook is signed. Remember that sound. It will return. A heavy maintenance check on a Lockheed L-1011 TriStar took 10,000 man-hours. Every panel came off the aircraft. Every system was stripped back to its primary components. The hydraulics were flushed and rebuilt. The avionics were bench-tested against specification. The structure was inspected with dye-penetrant and X-ray for fatigue cracks invisible to the naked eye. The engines came off entirely, crated, and went to the test cells. For a man who had spent 8 years learning Eastern's aircraft, a heavy check was a complete rereading of a familiar text, finding the hairline in the wing spar, the fretting in the control cable run, the bearing that had migrated 1/4 millimeter from true in 3,000 hours of flight. That knowledge was not in any manual. It lived in the hands of the people who had done it, year after year, in the hangars of Building 16. At peak, Eastern's maintenance division serviced 250 aircraft. The failure rate, the percentage of items requiring further work once initially cleared, was a closely tracked metric. Mechanics who missed things faced re-examination. The Federal Aviation Administration required logbook entries for every maintenance action. The standard was total, and the accountability was personal. Your name on the logbook meant your hands had done the work. By 1985, Eastern Airlines carried more passengers than any other carrier in the Air Transport Association. 48 million passengers in a single year, operating in 26 countries across 3 continents. The hockey stick livery, Caribbean blue above ionosphere blue, was one of the most recognized brand identities in American aviation. Eastern was the official airline of Walt Disney World. It was a launch customer for the Boeing 757 and the first American carrier to fly the Airbus A300. Its annual revenues exceeded $4 billion. Its maintenance base in Miami employed thousands. It had achieved something its founder had declared impossible for competitors: genuine scale without government dependency. And in 1978, while Eastern was posting the strongest passenger numbers in its history, Frank Borman ordered 757 aircraft from Boeing, at a unit cost that, combined with the Airbus A300 orders placed the previous year, loaded the airline with a debt burden that would eventually compound to $700,000 in daily interest charges before Eastern had sold a single ticket, fueled a single aircraft, or boarded a single passenger. If you find stories like this important, stories about the people who actually built things and what happened to them, hit subscribe. We publish one of these every week, and they're a future of what the guide belong. The Airline Deregulation Act of 1978 was not a death sentence for every carrier that faced it. Delta Airlines, which competed directly with Eastern at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. The same routes, the same passengers, the same pricing pressures from the new discount carriers came through the decade of deregulation in better shape than it entered it. Delta had a less unionized workforce. It had not loaded itself with capital debt in the same years that the new competitive environment was squeezing margins. It had a management culture that, whatever its flaws, did not treat its labor force as the primary obstacle to profitability. The external pressures Eastern faced in the late 1970s and early 1980s were real. People Express launched in 1981, offering fares that undercut Eastern's break-even cost structure. $23 New York to Buffalo was not something a carrier paying $700,000 in daily interest could match on a sustained basis. Fuel prices, which had spiked catastrophically after 1973, remained unpredictable. The Civil Aeronautics Board, which had previously set fares and routes and insulated the legacy carriers from the worst price competition, was being systematically wound down. These were genuine industry-wide forces, but they were industry-wide. Southwest Airlines, which had been flying since 1971, expanded aggressively through deregulation and built a low-cost model that has proved durable to this day. American Airlines restructured, built a hub at Dallas-Fort Worth, and emerged from the deregulation decade as the country's dominant carrier. Continental, under management before Lorenzo arrived, had problems, but Continental did not cease to exist until Lorenzo used bankruptcy law to void its union contracts and rebuild it on slashed wages. The airline industry was not doomed. Eastern's specific trajectory was the product of specific decisions made by specific people. The counter-argument that Eastern was simply a victim of structural change in the industry requires us to explain why Delta thrived on the same Atlanta routes. It requires us to explain why Americans' unionized mechanics did not go on strike in 1989 when Eastern's did. It requires us to explain why no bankruptcy court examiner was ever appointed to investigate whether Delta's management had cherry-picked its own airline's assets and transferred them below market value to affiliated companies. External pressure does not explain Eastern. Internal decisions explain Eastern. The external pressure is where this story begins. The internal decisions are where it ends. Two decisions killed Eastern Airlines. The first was made in 1978 by Frank Borman. The second was made in 1986 by a man who was never supposed to own it. Borman, former astronaut, Apollo 8 commander, a man whose personal credibility had been used in Eastern's "We have to earn our wings every day" advertising campaign, became Eastern's president in 1975. He was a gifted communicator and a poor financial strategist. Facing deregulation with an airline already carrying structural losses, Borman chose the aggressive capital option. He ordered the Boeing 757 in 1978, making Eastern the launch customer alongside British Airways. At a time when lower oil prices, the economic assumption underpinning the 757's efficiency case, failed to arrive. The Airbus A300 wide-body purchases from 1977, combined with the 757 commitment, loaded Eastern with debt that compounded through the early 1980s, until the airline was paying over $700,000 in daily interest before operations began each morning. By 1983, Borman was asking his employees to accept pay cuts to keep the airline viable. By 1986, having failed to reach agreement with the IAM's chief negotiator, Charlie Bryan, a man whose stubbornness was a match for Borman's own, he sold Eastern to Texas Air Corporation for a price that left the airline $3.5 billion in debt. The buyer was Frank Lorenzo. In 1983, Lorenzo had already placed Continental Airlines into Chapter 11 bankruptcy, despite the carrier having approximately $50 million in cash reserves, a maneuver widely understood as a mechanism to void Continental's union contracts and rebuild the airline on dramatically reduced wages. Thousands of Continental employees had lost their jobs. When Lorenzo arrived at Eastern in 1986, he controlled an empire. Texas Air Corporation owned Continental, People Express, Frontier Airlines, New York Air, and now Eastern, that carried more than a fifth of all American air passengers. Almost immediately, Eastern's assets began moving to Continental. The System 1 computerized reservation system, the backbone of Eastern's commercial operation, was sold to Texas Air below its market value. Aircraft followed. Routes followed. A bankruptcy court examiner named David Shapiro, appointed in 1989, would later find that in 12 of the 15 asset transfers he examined, Lorenzo had cheated Eastern and its creditors. Lorenzo settled out of court. In effect, he pleaded guilty to looting. The men who ran Eastern between 1959 and 1991 approached the airline as if it were a different company each time they arrived. Malcolm McIntyre, the lawyer who replaced Rickenbacker in 1959, understood courtrooms better than he understood cockpits. Floyd Hall, who took over in 1963, instituted a period of relative stability, but left the airline without a coherent strategy for the jet age's second decade. Sam Higginbottom, who was president during the L-1011 program in the early 1970s, made the decision to commit to the Lockheed TriStar, a decision that required steady nerves when Rolls-Royce's bankruptcy threatened the entire RB211 engine program. And Eastern's loyalty to that commitment was later cited by Stanley Hooker, Rolls-Royce's chief engineer, as having saved the program. Then Borman arrived and made the debt that ended everything. Under Lorenzo, Phil Bakes became Eastern's president. In 1988, Bakes announced 4,000 layoffs and the elimination of Western routes, saying Eastern was going back to its roots. He said this at a company that was paying $700,000 a day in interest it could not sustain. Lorenzo's reported compensation from his airline operations ran into the millions, while Eastern's mechanics were being asked to accept pay cuts that, in some negotiations, amounted to 50% of their existing wages. The salary versus founding contrast that Rickenbacker had lived and believed, he had built the first profitable American airline without subsidy, had kept it that way through discipline and personal austerity, was by the late 1980s visible in every quarterly report as a kind of inversion of everything he had stood for. The men at the top were extracting, the men at the bottom were being asked to absorb. In December 1989, ALPA's Miami Executive Council chairman, Jack Bavis, looked at what remained of Eastern's assets, most of the profitable ones already transferred, sold, or pledged, and told his pilots, even though Lorenzo won, he lost. And even though we lost, we won in the long run, because the airline isn't going to make it. The torque wrench clicks. The panel is closed. The logbook is signed. The same hands, the same ritual. But now the logbooks were being signed for an aircraft that might not be airworthy in the morning. We are just past halfway. If you are finding this valuable, the history, the research, the detail, a like takes 2 seconds and it means we can keep making these. Now back to the story. In the maintenance world, the phrase has a specific meaning. A supervisor takes a pen and signs off on a repair log entry. The work described in that entry has not been done. The aircraft goes back into service. The passengers who board it the following morning do not know that the fuel tank sumping procedure, designed to extract water and contaminants that accumulate in jet fuel and that, unchecked, can cause false fuel gauge readings and clogged fuel lines at altitude, was not performed. The logbook says it was. By January 1988, United Press International had spoken to dozens of current and former Eastern mechanics across Miami, Atlanta, Washington, Boston, and Kansas City. Their accounts were consistent and specific. Supervisors had pressured mechanics to sign off on repairs that had not been completed. Aircraft were being kept in service with deferred maintenance items that, in some mechanics' professional judgment, affected airworthiness. The pressure was not occasional, it was systemic. One Boston mechanic told UPI, You've got to remember, once you're up in the air, you can't just pull over to the shoulder and fix something that goes wrong. The FAA, under pressure from Congress after UPI's investigation generated national coverage, inspected Eastern's facilities across the country in the spring of 1988 and found 78,372 violations of federal safety regulations. The resulting fine, $9.5 million, the largest in aviation history at that time, was announced in February 1987, relating to violations that predated Lorenzo's arrival, but which the new management's cost-cutting environment had done nothing to correct. In July 1990, a federal grand jury in Brooklyn indicted Eastern Airlines and 10 of its managers, 8 current, 2 former, on charges related to falsifying maintenance records. U.S. Attorney Andrew Maloney stated the investigation had begun in September 1988, when an Eastern supervisor had voluntarily reported faulty practices to the federal prosecutor's office. The indictment covered events between July 1985 and October 1989. Among the specific charges, the deliberate use of Eastern's centralized computer system to falsify maintenance records in order to prevent the FAA from grounding improperly maintained aircraft. Eastern's Kennedy Airport maintenance base, where many of the alleged violations occurred, had already been closed the previous year, after the FAA fined the carrier $893,000 for faulty maintenance at that facility specifically. The men who flew those aircraft knew. Some of them had refused to fly. The evening before it ended, Eastern's reservation agents were answering phones. The airline had not told them. Callers asking about flights for the coming week were given bookings. People planning business trips, family reunions, Florida winter vacations were told the airline was not closing. The reservation agents, the people whose job it was to know, did not know themselves. Across Miami that night, in the houses and apartments of Dade County and north into Broward, 18,000 Eastern employees went to bed, not knowing that by morning they would no longer have jobs. Some were mechanics who had walked off the job in March 1989 and spent 686 days on the picket line outside the airport fence, watching replacement workers enter the facilities they had spent careers building. Some were pilots who had joined the sympathy strike on March 4, 1989, flown the line for 285 days, voted to return to work in November 1989, and found there was nothing to return to. Some were flight attendants, ticketing agents, ramp workers, avionics technicians, who had navigated nearly 2 years of bankruptcy court proceedings, while Martin Shagru, Lorenzo's court-appointed replacement as trustee, ran an advertising campaign called 100 Days, promising passengers Eastern would become a little bit better every day. The campaign had increased bookings by 73%. It had not saved the airline. At midnight, on Saturday, January 18, 1991, Eastern Airlines stopped flying. 5,000 of the 18,000 employees lost their jobs immediately, without notice. Reservation agents were told to report to work as scheduled. Everyone else was told to stay home unless specifically contacted. Ernie Mailhot was a ramp worker and cleaner, a rank-and-file striker with IAM Local Lodge 1018. He had been on the picket line for 686 days. He knew it was over before the official announcement because the pattern had become clear. Every avenue had been tried. Every buyout had been proposed. Every court appeal had been exhausted. When the airline finally folded, he wrote, "We showed that unlike the Lorenzos and the rest of the boss class in this country, who are motivated by greed for profits, workers will step forward and put themselves on the line in the interests of working people everywhere." 5,000 people. One night. No warning. The planes sat on the ramp at Miami International as the sun came up on Sunday morning. Engines cold. Logbooks closed. Nobody coming. The institutional record of Eastern Airlines' destruction is specific and available. It does not require interpretation. The facts, placed in sequence, do the work. David Shapiro, appointed as bankruptcy court examiner by Judge Burton Liffland in April 1989, investigated the series of asset transfers between Eastern and Lorenzo's other companies. His March 1990 report recommended that Texas Air pay Eastern more than $280 million, concluding that several deals between the two companies had left Eastern with less than market value for its assets. In 12 of the 15 transactions he examined, he found Eastern had been shortchanged. Lorenzo settled out of court, in effect, as Alpa's attorneys noted at the time, pleading guilty to the central charge. The bankruptcy court's own eventual description of Eastern's collapse was recorded as a case study in corporate abuse. In the U.S. Department of Transportation's proceedings that followed, Frank Lorenzo was declared unfit to operate an airline. He was effectively barred from holding a position of control in any American carrier. Congress debated Eastern's fate while it was ongoing. On November 21, 1989, President George H.W. Bush vetoed the bipartisan commission bill that would have established a presidential emergency board, the mechanism that had been used 211 times since 1928 to prevent airline strikes, and which had never before been refused by a sitting president. ALPA President Hank Duffy said afterwards, "We knew the Bush administration was not pro-labor, but we had no comprehension of the depths to which they would stoop to carry Frank Lorenzo's water." The following day, the pilots' union voted to end the sympathy strike. There were no jobs left. Frank Ortis, vice president of IAM Lodge 702 in Miami, the local covering Eastern's maintenance base, stood on a picket line outside the airport on March 4, 1989, and said, "We're here for as long as it takes. We feel we're at war right now with Frank Lorenzo." John Hill, a second-generation mechanic picketing outside the same fence where his father had once walked in to work, told reporters, "Nobody wants to be out here, but it's worse in there." Between 1986 and 1991, Lorenzo lost $1.2 billion in Eastern's operations, sold off $1.5 billion in assets, and over 45,000 employees lost their jobs in the airline's strike and eventual liquidation. The number, 45,000, contains within it entire communities. What happened to the physical remains of Eastern's empire was methodical and largely unwitnessed. Building 16, the Ivory Tower, the executive headquarters that Frank Borman had moved from Rockefeller Center in New York to the northeast corner of Miami International in 1975, the building constructed in the 1960s and well enough built, according to the contractor who eventually tore it down, that the demolition took longer than anticipated, came down in the early 2000s. The eastbound Airport Expressway ramp now runs close to where its north face once stood. Building 11, which housed flight operations and commercial computer operations, was demolished at the same time. Of the entire Eastern complex, only Building 5A survived, now occupied by the County Aviation Department's accounting division, its facilities staff, its personnel, and risk management sections. The assets that could be moved were moved. American Airlines purchased Eastern's Latin American routes, the most valuable franchise Eastern held by the end, for $471 million in May 1990, paid not to Eastern's creditors in full, but into the bankruptcy estate, from which partial payments were distributed. Delta acquired Eastern's gates at Atlanta and many of its Lockheed L-1011 TriStar aircraft. Northwest acquired the Washington National gates. Donald Trump ran the shuttle service as the Trump Shuttle until his own financial difficulties forced a sale. Eastern's brand name passed through intellectual property purchases to a series of successors, none of which had any continuity with the maintenance expertise, route heritage, or institutional knowledge of the original. An attempt to revive the name commercially in 2015 operated from Building 5A at Miami International, the one surviving structure of the original complex, described in filings as formerly housing the system and maintenance control centers of the original airline. That venture ceased operations in 2017. Another iteration launched under the Eastern name in 2020. Today, the Eastern brand carries Boeing 767 and 777 aircraft in cargo and charter operations. Its marketing does not dwell on maintenance. The airline that was, by its own operating standards, the largest commercial aircraft maintenance and overhaul operation ever assembled in North America. The airline whose mechanics worked J-75 jet engine repairs in Miami in 1960, while IAM officials watched and noted the precision, the seriousness, the craft, is now a brand name attached to a smaller carrier based in Kansas City. The torque wrench clicks. The panel is closed. The logbook is signed. Somewhere else now, by someone else's hands. Captain Wayne Dolan had been flying Eastern's Boeing 727s for 25 years by the time the strike came. He had got out of the Army in 1964, learned to fly in a Colorado civilian flight school, and joined Eastern during the great hiring wave of the mid-1960s. He flew the line through the golden years, through the early labor disputes, through the Borman debt years, through the arrival of Lorenzo. He was a loyal member of the Airline Pilots Association throughout. When the airline folded, he was working as an independent painting and roofing contractor in Baltimore. He had lost the airline, the pension, the career, the community of colleagues. He said, "I don't have a job, but Frank doesn't have an airline either." Ernie Mailhot, the IAM ramp worker and strike coordinator who had walked the picket line for 686 days, found work in other IAM organized industries. Packing houses, aerospace. He took the lessons of the strike with him. He wrote, "Thousands of us are now working in other IAM organized jobs. We take the lessons of the strike with us, and one lesson we will never forget is, an injury to one is an injury to all." Across Dade County, the community impact of Eastern's closure spread through every neighborhood where Eastern families had lived. Above average wages, eliminated. Excellent benefits, cancelled overnight. The suppliers who had survived on Eastern's business, the catering companies, the uniform manufacturers, the parts distributors, the ground equipment operators, began their own reckonings. The New York Times reported at the time that Eastern's prominence in the Miami area had already been declining as the city became a finance and trade center with a diversified economy, rather than one based largely on tourism. But the 18,000 jobs that disappeared in January 1991 were not absorbed by the new diversification. The skills that Eastern's mechanics carried, knowledge of the L-1011's hydraulic system, of the A300's avionics architecture, of the 727's fuel system quirks, accumulated over careers of 20 and 25 years, became, for most of their holders, unmonetizable. The airlines that bought Eastern's aircraft needed mechanics. They did not rehire Eastern's mechanics as a matter of course. The expertise dispersed. Some of it vanished. Aviation Week and Space Technology had run a headline in 1988. Eastern's safety record under scrutiny. The mechanics who had reported the violations to the US Attorney in 1988 were never given their airline back. On April 6, 1989, less than a month after the strike began, Eastern Airlines agreed to be acquired by Peter Ueberroth, the former commissioner of Major League Baseball, the man who had organized the Los Angeles Olympics, for $464 million. The deal had credibility. Ueberroth had operational credibility from the Olympics. He had the financial backing. The unions, by this point willing to consider almost any management change that removed Lorenzo, had signaled they could work with him. On April 12, 1989, Lorenzo refused to give temporary control of the airline to a trustee as a condition of the sale. The transaction was terminated on April 18. Jay Pritzker, of the Hyatt Hotel family, had also been in discussions. Carl Icahn had been approached. Each potential buyer encountered the same obstacle: Lorenzo's unwillingness to cede control or accept terms that would have left him accountable to new ownership during the transition period. The Bankruptcy Court Examiner's March 1990 report, recommending that Texas Air repay Eastern more than $280 million, was the institutional acknowledgement that a different trajectory had been available, that the airline's value, at the point of filing, exceeded $4 billion, and that what followed in Chapter 11 proceedings destroyed an estimated $2 billion of that value over 22 months. Harvard Business School's later case analysis of the Eastern bankruptcy described it as an illustration of how a court's overprotective stance had insulated a distressed company from the reality of its situation, extending a process that produced $1.3 billion in operating losses instead of allowing an orderly restructuring or sale. Whether any of the proposed acquisitions would have saved Eastern is genuinely unknowable. Uberoth's management track record was in sports administration and event organization, not airline operations. The structural problems, high labor costs, weak route coverage, the deregulated competitive environment, were real and would have remained under any buyer. What is known is that on April 12, 1989, the last credible path to a functioning Eastern Airlines was closed by a single refusal. 77 former Eastern pilots and mechanics found work together at other carriers. 3 generations of Eastern families scattered across the American aviation industry. The IAM's District Lodge 100, which had covered Eastern's Miami base, carried on representing workers in other industries. 77 out of 40,000. The smallness is part of the truth. Eddie Rickenbacker died on July 23, 1973, in Zurich, Switzerland, where he had travelled to find treatment for his wife. His body was returned to Miami, to the city where his airline had its operational heart. General James H. Doolittle, one of the great figures of American aviation, gave the eulogy. Rickenbacker is buried at Green Lawn Cemetery in Columbus, Ohio, the city where a 12-year-old boy had left school the morning after his father died in a construction accident and had not stopped moving for the next 69 years. The maintenance base he would have recognized, the hangars, the test cells, the engine shops, the sheet metal bays, exists no longer in any form. Building 16, the Ivory Tower, came down in the early 2000s after taking longer to demolish than the contractors expected. Building 11 followed. The airport expressway ramp runs through the space where Eastern's people once worked the overnight shift. Building 5A is an accounting office. What can be found at Miami International today is a restored Eastern DC-7. Not a working aircraft, but a museum piece, placed alongside an American Douglas DC-3 for the 2011 opening of the South Terminal. It was there for a ceremony. Hundreds of spectators came. The aircraft was static. The engines were cold. The Eastern Airlines collection is held at Georgia State University's Special Collections and Archives, donated in the years following the closure. It contains photographs, correspondence, union records, oral histories. It is well maintained. It is not an airline. The brand that Rickenbacker built into the most profitable airline in the post-war era, the maintenance base that serviced 250 aircraft and employed generations of Dade County workers, the route network that pioneered New York to Florida, New York to Latin America, Miami to London. It carried 48 million passengers in 1985 and was gone 6 years later. The bankruptcy court called it a case study in corporate abuse. The court-appointed examiner found the airline had been systematically stripped. The U.S. Department of Transportation declared its final owner unfit to operate. The torque wrench clicks. The panel is closed. The logbook is signed. No one is coming to open it again. If this story meant something to you, if you think the people who built things deserve to be remembered, subscribe. Every week, we tell one more of these. The stories are not running out. The airports are full of ghosts.